Thank you. What a lovely welcome. Thanks, Anant. So I have to start by admitting that despite the topic of my book, not every day in my past has been a good day. And in fact, as I stand here in front of you in heels, I'm actually reminded of a time that was early in my career at McKinsey as a consultant. And it was the very first time that I was being allowed to present to the board, which was exciting and also nerve-wracking. And so I was nervous, and mostly I was deciding that I would project gravitas and presence into the room by striding about as boldly as I could. Much like this. And I was, in my mind, owning the room. I'd even look down and check the cabling to make sure I wasn't going to trip over. So here I am, owning the room. And then something happened which I had not planned for. I took perhaps one of my boldest steps into the middle of the room. Some of you know what happened. Then I heard this crack. And it turns out that it is actually entirely possible for a heel to shear completely off a shoe, which is then obviously what happened. So as I'm lying on the floor, it turns out that it was pretty impossible to project any further gravitas or presence into the room. So there are things we can't control. There are wardrobe malfunctions, there are technology glitches, miscommunications, difficult colleagues, difficult deadlines. Of course there are things we can't control, but I've always been interested in something I call the philosophy of realistic optimism, which is to say, not to say that everything is awesome and everything is amazing if you just say it enough, but to look hard at the constraints, look them in the eye and say, okay, what can we do around them and through them? Where's our wiggle room? What's our scope for action here? And for me, the toolbox that I've turned to is behavioral science, because we only have to understand a little of how the brain works and why we behave and think and feel as we do, and why other people think and feel and behave as they do, to see that we've got a lot more control over things that actually seem quite random from day to day, but aren't. Things that seem fixed in our lives that we have to adapt to, but we actually can control to a certain extent. So I'd like to tell 3 stories today about things that we think of as fixed, that we have to adapt to. I'm going to talk about reality, the big one. How can we change the reality we experience? I'm going to talk about time. How do we get more time in the day? And I'm going to talk about intelligence. How do you boost your intelligence? Something that we also tend to think of as rather fixed. So that's the plan. Okay. Let me start then by talking about another day when reality wasn't treating me quite so well. I was a bit further on in my career as a management consultant at this point. I was a partner. But even as a senior person there, I still had to do things that I didn't enjoy. And I'd been asked to join this project that I was not excited about. It was a huge corporate change program. And by that time in my life, I knew that the kind of work that I was most interested in and that I most enjoyed was more human scale. I liked working with individuals, coaching individuals and coaching teams. So I was grumpy, extra grumpy, about being on this program. And I was working alongside a guy who was kind of in the opposite place. He was very excited about the work. A guy called Lucas, picture, a tall, wiry, well-dressed, highly energetic German guy, very good at process, and he was all over this project. And this day that I'm remembering was the first day that we were supposed to be meeting our clients. I was already grumpy because I didn't want to be on the project. And then I was also extra grumpy because we were supposed to be meeting the clients, but it was a video conference. I thought this was a terrible idea. We should be meeting people in person instead of being in a video conference. And then I was even more dismayed when I walked into the room and saw that it was a long, dark room, a little bit like this, less pleasant, lower ceilings, not as nice people in the room. And there was a screen in front of us, and we were sitting there, disembodied, faces floating in front of us. This was our kick-off meeting. And it was as bad as I expected. Lots of misunderstandings, miscommunications, people cutting each other off, frowns. It wasn't great. So afterwards, I thought, well, I'll be a good citizen. I will sit down with Lucas and I will share my worries that we've gotten off to a bad start with the project. And I can still picture the conversation. He was sitting there. I was telling him all of these things that had gone wrong. He was looking at me as if I was a little bit mad. He said, first of all, he hadn't remembered the things that I was talking about. But then he went on to tell me about all of these things that I had not noticed. People laughed several times. People were really happy with the progress that we made. This deck that he was powering through, there were lots of slides that people had really loved. I had no recollection of this, and yet he was compelling enough that I actually realized that on the edge of my consciousness, he was not making this up. So what was going on? I mean, yes, we had different personalities, of course, but something else was going on. It was as if we'd truly been in a different meeting from each other. And of particular interest to me, why had he enjoyed himself so much more than me? And this is where it helps to understand the brain. Our brains are amazing. They can do sums, they can guess what someone's thinking, they can even tell jokes if they're connected to a big enough mouth. But there are things that they can't do. And one thing that they can't do is they can't take in everything that's around them at any one time. When you think about all of the bits of information in a room, if you really focused on every fiber of the floor tiles and you focused on every hair of the person sitting next to you and every sensation in your body, your brain would crash like an overloaded computer. So there's an elegant solution that your brain employs, which is to filter out most of what's going on around you so that you're not even conscious of it. And as a result, we're all experiencing an edited, partial version of reality all the time. This is a little bit mind-blowing because we don't like to think of it. We think of ourselves as being objective, but the reality that we're experiencing is not the same as everyone else around us because their filters are operating differently to yours. And then the question is, well, what determines what you filter in and filter out? And this is where the big opportunity lies, because it's quite predictable what we tend to notice and what we don't notice. It turns out that whatever is already top of mind for us will determine what our brain decides is important enough for us to consciously notice. Whatever's top of mind for us. Let me give you an example of a study that I like in this area. It's a field called selective attention, the fact that we can only pay attention to selection of what's around us. There's a bunch of radiologists. It was a Harvard study, and they were given a pile of lung scans to look through, sadly genuine lung scans. And they're looking for nodules, of course. And the last of the lung scans, there was a gorilla printed inside one of the lungs. Now, how many of the radiologists do you think saw the gorilla? So it's close to that. It's close to zero. 83% of the radiologists did not see the gorilla, even though eye tracking devices showed that they looked directly at it. Even though the gorilla was 44 times the size of the average lung nodule. And even though they're trained to spot abnormalities. So why didn't they spot it? Because gorillas were not top of mind for them. So that wasn't what they were looking for, and their brain completely filtered it out. Now, the massive opportunity for us is to be more deliberate about what we want to have top of mind going into a day, going into a meeting, going into a task. Because if we fall out of bed on the wrong side and we're grumpy, our brain will say, okay, so you're grumpy. That means that what's salient, what's most relevant for you to notice is everything that confirms the world is a terrible place. So you'll spot the guy being a jerk, the guy letting the door slam in your face, and you won't notice the person holding it open. You won't notice the person who's smiling at you in a non-creepy way on the subway. And we can turn that around and say, how about I decide to set my aims and my attitude and my assumptions in a more positive direction, and that will determine where I put my attention. And that's a little routine I call setting intentions, and I do it each day. I do it sometimes the night before. I do it sometimes as I'm hurtling into a meeting and I've forgotten to do it before. And I say, Caroline, what really matters to you? What's therefore your real aim? Check in with your attitude and your assumptions. What does that mean you really want to pay attention to? And I've not had a meeting quite like the one I had with Lucas ever since. Because even if the meeting is going badly, I can take a time out quietly halfway through and say, okay, now what's my real aim? What do I want to have top of mind? And it might be to say, okay, I need to learn from this experience. And then I experience the rest of the meeting in a different way. And I've even got an emergency version of this, which is when I'm grumpy of a morning and I'm walking along and I say, okay, I'm going to decide to notice 3 good things in the next 5 minutes. The power of that is that you notice things you wouldn't have noticed. Plus, then, because you've got good things top of mind, you notice more. And that changes the trajectory of the day. So we can shape reality. We can shape the reality that we experience really quite deeply and quite powerfully and quite easily. So that's the first thing that behavioral science teaches us that we have more control over than we think. Let me talk now about time. Who here would like more hours in the day? Yes, of course we would. There are a couple of ways that I know of getting more hours in the day. I like science fiction. I watch a lot of science fiction movies, so I know that going to the edge of a black hole is apparently a great way of getting more hours in the day. Hard to fit that into the average workday. So let me talk about the second technique, which you definitely can fit in. And to demonstrate how this works, I'm going to get you to do a very small exercise. I'm going to ask you, first of all, to count to 7 as fast as you can, out loud, with some energy, on my mark, like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Are you ready? Go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Excellent. Now I'm going to ask you to do the same with letters. I'm going to ask you to say A, B, C, D, F, G. Again, energy, on my mark, go. A, B, C, D, F, G. Even sharper and faster and more cult-like. Excellent. Now, I'd like you to mix the two up. I'd like you to say A1, B2, C3, again, as fast as you can. On my mark, go. A1, B2, C3, 4, 5. I don't think you just gave up, right? So I'm going to ask some obvious questions. I'm going to ask you, first of all, which was quicker, doing them on their own or doing them mixed up? On their own. When did you make more mistakes, doing them on their own or mixed up? Yes. You've just basically revealed many, many years of research which suggest that when we multitask, we actually slow ourselves down dramatically, and we make between 2 and 4 times as many errors. When we multitask, we make ourselves a little bit dumber and a little bit slower. And yet, that's how we cope with our lives where we have instant messages coming at us all the time, emails coming at us all the time. We're tempted by all the wonderful websites that are out there, and then you're having to get your work done. You're talking to people. We're trying to process in parallel. But our brain can actually only do one thing consciously at once. It's a single tasker. Automatic stuff can be done in parallel, brushing your teeth while you're checking it. That's okay. But conscious tasks, you can only do one thing at once. So what your poor brain is trying to do when you're checking your email whilst you're getting on with some task or other is it's doing what you were doing, switching between letters and numbers. It's going from here to here to here. And in each of those switches, you're losing a bit of time and a bit of mental energy. And that's why you slow yourself down, and that's why you make more errors. So we actually get our work done more quickly and better if we decide to single task, especially around the tasks that really matter to us, where it really matters for us to get it right. And that means in our lives, the kind of lives that we lead, it means going offline for periods of time. And since this is something which I've been talking and writing about for quite a long time, I developed a raft of techniques that I used for this when I was in corporate life. I was an avid user of airplane mode on my phone, very quickly flipping that on whenever I really needed to concentrate. I had an enormous pair of noise-cancelling headphones that I used to wear, not just to actually reduce ambient noise, but also to try and signal to my colleagues that I was focusing, to the point where even when the batteries ran out, I would still keep on wearing the headphones. And I used to batch my email as much as I could so that I was blitzing it 2 or 3 times a day rather than 2 or 3 times a minute, which meant that I was getting through it more quickly because I wasn't switching all the time from email to other things. And then when I started writing the book, I had a lot less structure in my life, and I had to up my game because I was finding all sorts of ways to get around airplane mode. I'd then go into my browser and start finding ways to be distracted that way. So I used apps to block my access to social media during working hours. And in the end, I also got myself a timer to sit on my desk, which I would set for a certain number of minutes to stay focused, to single task, and then it would count down to 0. And you know, the reason that it helped, apart from giving me a point of focus and promising myself I didn't have to do it for that much longer, was that when it got to 0, I got an approving little beep. Beep. Which was like a pat on the back. It made me feel good for having been able to stay focused for that length of time. And that's helpful because why do we stay online? Because it's quite nice to feel wanted and to have the ping and the buzz of the phone. Like, oh, somebody wants me. So trying to give yourself a pat on the back for actually staying offline is a very powerful way of encouraging yourself to do it more. So single tasking, you'll make your time go further and it will make you feel as if there are more hours in the day. Then let's talk about your intelligence. This is a very intelligent room here. Yes? Yes. You're all very modest, but we know that we're an intelligent room here. But even you know that there are days when you're firing on all cylinders and days when you're not, or days when the tasks in front of you seem a little bit harder. Maybe it's something completely new and you're a bit stuck. So is there a way that we can suddenly become more intelligent? Is there a way that we can kind of suddenly stick a second brain onto our heads? I'm going to tell you about one day that I learned a technique which definitely does give you a bit of a mental lift when you most need it. I was getting certified as a coach. I was doing this course because I worked a lot with senior teams and boards, and I was often finding myself getting into one-to-one conversations with people who were asking me to help them, and I thought, well, I really need to kind of make sure that I've got the coaching credentials to do this work. So I went on this course, and it was a very bittersweet experience because I loved the course. Shouldn't be a problem, right? Except that I loved the coaching so much, I thought, oh no, this is what I have to do with my life. I have to be a coach, but I'm a partner at McKinsey and I quite like that. I quite like my job. I like my colleagues. I like the sense of belonging. I'm going to have to quit. I didn't want to quit. I was in this career dilemma and worrying about it a lot. And in a coaching course, when you're learning to coach someone, the way that you get your chops is to actually practice on each other and really, try to learn by doing. So there was one day that someone called Jill needed to practice her coaching skills on me. I needed to come up with a real topic to be coached on. This was the thing that was on my mind. So I said, okay, bring it on, Jill, coach me. She patiently did. And she started by saying, okay, so tell me what's going on. And I told her that this was a career dilemma and it couldn't be solved, it was a disaster and I was going to have to quit. And she said, okay, let's just stop for a moment. Caroline, what's the ideal situation here? And at first I was a bit grumpy because I said, well, if the ideal, there's no point talking about the ideal. The ideal is that I'm a coach at McKinsey, but that's not possible, so let's just move on, shall we? She was very patient with me. She then said, okay, let's describe that a little bit more, what that would actually look like. So I did that. And then she said, now, what would be the first step towards that ideal? And of course, the answer was blindingly obvious. It was, well, if I'm going to leave anyway, I've got nothing to lose. I might as well tell my colleagues that this is something I want to do more of, that I want to do more coaching in the workplace. Of course, then opportunities might arise, and if they don't, I can still leave anyway. And you're looking at me like I'm an idiot, because of course that's an obvious thing to do. But it wasn't obvious to me when I was stuck in the mire of the problem, because I was so focusing on the negative that my brain was doing something very specific. It was going into defensive mode. So when we are facing a threat in our lives, our brain has a very wonderful defensive mechanism which has kept us safe for millennia, which is you might know as a fight or flight response. There's actually a third response, which is to freeze. So we might be snappish, we might run away or hide, we might actually properly fight. There might be real fisticuffs. We might just keep our head down and hope that nothing happens. Fight, flight, freeze is still our defensive response to anything that feels like a bit of a threat in the workplace, just as it was with charging mammoths on the savannah. And there are two things to know about this defensive response. The first is that it does not take a charging mammoth to trigger it. Even someone frowning at you, certainly someone cutting you off in a meeting, certainly a task that feels just too difficult to solve, these things will trigger that defensive reaction. And then the second thing to know about defensive mode is that when your brain goes into defensive mode, it's directing some mental energy away from the more sophisticated part of your brain. That means you can see on a brain scan that when people are even mildly stressed, that there's less activity in their prefrontal cortex. So here's the rub. You're faced with a challenging situation. Just at that moment when you need to rise to it, you become slightly less sharp, slightly less intelligent. So what Jill did was very clever, because she was lifting me out of this defensive mode by asking me a question, which got me to focus on something which was far more positive. What's the ideal situation? And what's the first step towards that? It was very rewarding to think about the ideal, and then also to think about a step that I could actually take. It boosted my sense of competence. Bam, I'm out of defensive mode. I'm thinking more clearly and creatively. And to see this time and time again in meetings where people are getting bogged down, to ask a question like that, to pull people out of defensive mode and get them refocused on what the ideal might be and what a step towards that might be. Or to say, when have we solved a problem like this before? And what can we learn from that? It's a way of giving yourself a few extra IQ points on days when you might be struggling a little bit, or when you're facing problems that seem insurmountable. So to recap, by setting your intentions clearly and positively, you can shape the way that you experience reality. Second, by single tasking as much as you can, and especially in the work that really matters to you, you can steal back more time in the day. And you can give yourself a boost in intelligence and in mood by using positive task framing, asking yourself what's the ideal and what's the first step towards that. These are just 3 tiny, tiny, tiny little steps that emerge from the behavioral science that can have enormous impacts on the way that every day feels. And more enjoyable reality, more time and more intelligence, that has to be a recipe for a good day. Thank you.
So we have some mics set up here for Q&A. So feel free to jump up. I have a few questions for you myself, Caroline. So,
and he's read the book. So.
Yeah, I've read the book as well, so I recommend it to all of you guys. We were chatting a little bit about this before. I know you mentioned it took 4 years almost to write the book, a little over 4. What for you was most challenging and rewarding kind of coming out of this experience of taking the best of what you've learned in your professional life, reading the research studies to come up with these clear insights that are actionable for everybody here, and to really have that better day? I
mean, I would say that it's the hardest thing that I've ever done, but it's the most rewarding thing. To take stock of everything that you've done over the last 20 years professionally and say, what's the essence of this and how can I share this? I mean, it's quite a privilege. And I never lost sight of that, even when I was feeling very lonely, because it's a very solitary experience to write a book. And I think that was the most difficult thing. I was so used to doing this work with people that inevitably at some points you have to actually say, no, my job now is actually writing the book. There's a great management thinker, Linda Grattan, who told me this very early on in the process. She said, at some point you have to accept that your job is writing this book. And so yes, that period where I didn't get the chance to actually still be working with people. But it's been worth it. It's been worth it, because now I get to go back out into the world and talk to wonderful people like you. So.
Awesome. I know throughout the book as well, you mentioned sleep, which didn't come up kind of in any of the stories you mentioned today. And everybody here at work, in our professional lives, our personal lives, sleep, physical activity, kind of two of the first things we let slip by. And you've shown in countless studies that you've researched, your own experience, whether it drives fight or flight, whether it drives the unpleasant meeting that we're having, it's something we let go. So kind of what are your few tips to squeeze into an extra half hour or an hour that'll really then make that difference? And I think maybe share with the audience some of those kind of findings that come out.
I mean, we all know on one level that the way we treat our body affects the way our mind works. We know that when we're underslept, we become somehow less witty and charming. But we often behave as if the connection isn't direct. We might accept that there's a long-term connection, but actually the research is really compelling. It says that the way that you treat your body has an immediate effect on your mental state. So the research on exercise is fantastically encouraging for someone like me who does not like going to the gym. I did a lot of sport when I was younger as a kid, and then, you know, it's hard to fit team sports into adult life, and so I always struggled with getting enough exercise into my day. I was personally very encouraged by the research, which says, in terms of the benefits to your cognitive state, doing more exercise boosts your emotional resilience, and it makes you sharper and more focused and more analytically smart. Immediately, goodness, okay, you can get that after 20 minutes of moderate exercise. I thought, okay, 20 minutes, moderate exercise, that's a brisk walk. I can do that. I started walking a lot more. And I was even more encouraged with more research that's been coming out in the last year or two, which suggests that it's not even just 20 minutes. You can break it down into chunks of 5 or 10 minutes. There was one study that I read that said, you know, obviously, you know, more exercise might be better than some, but some is better than none. And I took that to heart. So I walk a lot more and seize every opportunity. So it's sort of, you know, we know that on one level that that's a good thing, but actually just to know that it's immediately going to improve your mood and your focus is, you know, that helps you kind of put the time in. And then with sleep, yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I spoke at Google in London a couple of weeks ago, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, if there's one thing out of all of this physical stuff that you're talking about, you know, that I should be looking after, what is it? And I said, well, it is sleep. There's definitely very clear research, as you've probably heard about this, that going short of sleep is equivalent to having a few drinks. And you know, you wouldn't say that someone at work who was short of sleep was an excellent worker if they were drunk. But we kind of have a slightly macho approach to saying, you know, yeah, I only got 4 hours last night, I'm working really hard. The truth is that, all the evidence suggests that you have less memory of what you did and you learn less from what you're doing if you go short on sleep. So all of that, yes, so what do you then do? I think, you know, some of it is just about an attitude and a mindset, and not seeing sleep as a luxury, not seeing sleep as downtime, but seeing it as essential uptime. You know, it's when your brain is doing encoding and consolidation. And that subtle shift into saying that this is actually going to make me smarter when I wake up tomorrow morning, I think it's been very helpful for me. That, and recognizing that, you know, when you have a lot of light around you, and particularly lights from your devices, it's going to delay your sleep cycle. So there's research at Harvard, more recent than some of the sleep research, saying that we push our rhythms back by half an hour for every half an hour that we're sitting with our phone late at night. So there's something about sleep hygiene and just making sure that your room is actually dark enough, and that really helps too.
In another chapter, I think you mentioned the whole chapter is about managing relationships. And there is a few pages that have common defensive mode triggers that you might elicit in a person you're engaging with. So can you touch upon a little bit in some of these tense situations where you don't necessarily have the time to maybe diagnose the situation or identify the telltale sign? How would you react accordingly? How can we, again, implement those types of things on a quick notice, and maybe even outline for the audience kind of what those common defensive triggers might be?
So what Anant is talking about is that, when someone is behaving dysfunctionally, and you've got this split-second decision where you can kind of declare that they're a jerk, or you can decide that there might be something going on with them. Now, there's something in psychology which is called the fundamental attribution error. And the way it works is that if we show up and we're a bit cranky at work, we know it's because we didn't get enough sleep. But if someone else is cranky, then we have a tendency to decide that they're a terrible person. Because why? Because your brain is always trying to take shortcuts, and it's a lot simpler to just declare that this person is not that nice versus thinking about, well, what could be going on with them? It's just, simpler to just badge them in a certain way. So one of the things that you can do is just get yourself familiar with the common triggers that might be causing, apart from lack of sleep, dysfunctional behavior that might be putting someone into defensive mode. So there's individual ones like competence, autonomy, and security. Anything that undermines someone's sense of competence, their autonomy, their sense of security will put them into defensive mode and make them behave badly. Then there's social needs like belonging, and fairness and respect. And as soon as any of those are violated at all, then you have a situation where, again, that defensive mode is going to be triggered. So it helps to just know the territory and just to get into the habit of saying, okay, this is probably not a psychopath. This is probably just, statistically, it's unlikely that they're a psychopath. They're probably what I call good person in bad circumstances. What are the circumstances? You tell yourself a few stories around those themes. Or it could be something even more basic, like their cat died, right? That's not even on the list. That's just something that makes you sad. So just stopping and giving yourself that pause and saying, what could be going on with them, changes your demeanor towards them, which de-escalates the situation because you're not then putting them further on the defensive. And that is a great first step. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that you can do, like showing appreciation, fantastic silver bullet. It hits competence, security, belonging. It just makes for a quick way of getting the other person out of defensive mode. Should we ask the audience for some questions? Yes.
Do you want to step up to the mic? Yeah.
So your discussion about multitasking and productivity was really interesting. A lot of people that I've met, I feel like want to believe that they have some special ability to just, they could juggle whatever and check their phone, their email. And I'm just wondering if the research that you saw really showed a gradient from kind of what people can handle and different people's abilities versus you're probably the best person qualified to answer this question, so might as well ask you.
Thank you very much for asking. Yeah, so one of the reasons that we tend to think we can multitask is that there are certain things we can multitask with, right? So if it's an automatic task, the automatic system in our brain generally can do multiple things in parallel. So that's why you can find your way to work without necessarily concentrating on where you're going while you're doing something else, maybe checking your messages. It's why when you're driving, it might be possible for you to have a conversation with someone. But the moment that anything changes in the situation, perhaps you're driving along and a car pulls out, and it requires conscious attention from you, then you're back in the mode of only being able to do one thing at a time. And that's why so many crashes happen when people are talking, because it feels as if it's possible to do things in parallel, and then something changes requires conscious attention. So I think that's one of the reasons we tend to believe that we can, with conscious tasks as well as with unconscious tasks. But there's really interesting research out there showing that people who are most confident of their ability to multitask are actually the worst at it. Why might that be? I mean, it might be that they've lost the ability to be mentally agile because they're just totally bombarded all the time. It's really interesting. And I think also this sort of trope that's been out there for a long time that women can somehow multitask, right? For the women in the audience, don't believe it. When it comes to the kind of conscious work that we're doing at work, we really can't. We're no different from men. So just to lay that one out there. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool, this is really interesting. Did you find that your techniques for having a good day and turning a bad day into a better day changed when you started working at home and away from other people with less things to influence you and less things to notice that you could frame in positive ways?
That's a good, interesting question. I mean, I've had quite a few different sort of types of work and career in my life, and I definitely think that when you move into a new setting, you have to, you do have to take a step back and say, okay, some of the things that I did before, it is different. I mean, the multitasking example was so vivid to me, that I thought I really nailed this, and then actually, oh my goodness, I really haven't, because of the change in circumstances. So I guess what I would advocate is just, checking in with yourself and developing a self-awareness so that you maybe take the principles, the stuff in the book. I've seen work across lots of different settings and lots of different industries and roles, and the stories in the book reflect that. So I've tried to create, a manual that can sort of apply to all sorts of different settings. But the way that it translates into your own life, yeah, you need to experiment with that for sure, especially around times of change. Yeah.
Hi. This is fantastic, and I think it's, certainly as hopefully high-functioning adults, we can sort of take some of this to heart. I'm wondering if you have any, A, if there's research, or B, if you have any recommendations for how you would coach children to implement some of this.
Well, I have to say that, most of my clients have children, and most of them tell me that they practice on their children before they practice on their colleagues. I hear a lot about teenage children. I hear a lot about spouses, actually. I've had a lot of people tell me that the techniques have improved their marriage. I actually even had one of my clients tell me about how he'd used some of the techniques from the relationship part of the book with his 1-year-old son. So they were worried that their son was slow in starting to pick up language. And his wife was particularly concerned that Francesco wasn't speaking enough to the child. And so Francesco, having fresh from the reading all the stuff on relationships and rapport and the power of actually truly deeply listening and paying close attention and playing back what you're hearing, decided to do that with his young son. And so instead of just talking at him, he would listen to what the little one was saying, and then repeat it back, and then add in 1 or 2 extra words. And his language acquisition skills went off the charts so quickly. Because even at that young age, all of the things that we're talking about in terms of competence, autonomy, security, belonging, fairness, respect, these things kick in very early. So I would say that all of the techniques, as far as I know, can be tried with children. And I'd love to hear if you'd like to give it a go. Thank you.
Hi. The tip that you gave about using a timer sounds fascinating. I'm wondering if there's an ideal amount of time that we can focus.
Yeah, it's a good question. There are lots of different views on this. You've got people who swear by the Pomodoro technique, which is the 25 minutes. There are some people who say 90 minutes is optimal for really deep work. I guess it goes back to the earlier point. You do need to experiment. I'll be honest, when I came out of corporate life, I had to start with 5 minutes. I had to retrain myself. And I started with 5, and then I went up to 10. And eventually I went round to 90. And then for me, I ended up putting it back to 45 minutes because I found that I would find it quite easy, not easy, but I mean, it became second nature to focus for 45 minutes. If I was really engaged in a task, then I'd go past the 45 minutes and I'd feel really good. If I set it at 60 or 75 or 90, and then I kind of lost focus before then, it would set up a dynamic where I'd be kind of slightly disappointed with myself. And I discovered it was a much better dynamic to set it for a shorter amount of time, then feel really great about myself, and then be more inclined to try it again. So I would start small and build up.
So set really low expectations for yourself.
Yes. I probably shouldn't admit the 5-minute thing, but I just did. So.
Do you have to worry about realistic optimism or positivism delaying change that could help you in your life?
Yeah, sometimes people say, well, sometimes you just need to quit your job. Actually, you're just not in the right place. You're not in the right fit. I think that sometimes you do need to make big changes. And the one thing I would say is that I think that focusing on the day-to-day, focusing on improving the small steps in your life, puts you in a better position to make the big decisions. If you're thinking about making a career move, it's much more likely that you'll make good choices if you're not doing it from a place of desperation. So the more that you can improve the day-to-day, I think the more that you'll obviously enjoy the journey a bit more, but you'll also probably choose the destination more effectively.
Do we have any more audience questions?
This is actually just more of a comment about the multitasking. My 86-year-old mother-in-law claims that she can, and there's no arguing that point. So where it became really obvious to me about the automatic and how when the automatic is no longer automatic, it really changes everything. I had a foot problem, which was very painful under the ball of my left foot. Every single step I took with my left foot, I had to think about.
Yeah.
And if you don't think your world doesn't change when you have to think about walking, it's pretty incredible. And I would even actually, on the weekends, not do things because the sheer energy of having to walk to Lower Manhattan or do something actually would prevent me from doing that because of all the thinking involved, not the pain.
Yeah.
I'm living with that, but it's the thinking about the walking.
Absolutely, beautiful example, right? Our brain's working memory has such a small capacity that even a blinking light or a buzzing phone or something that is as simple as walking can take part of your brain's mental energy and make it harder to think about anything else. Really nice example. Thank you. Thank you.
Cool. Well, hopefully everybody's got a few insights and tips now that they can take away. Let's give another round of applause to Caroline.
Thank you.